Prologue. The unassuming room in the basement of their father's keep was cramped as it held the 8 sons of Sciron Barshon. Outside, it was the deepest part of the night. Despite the darkness that rolled over their land, the warmth of the long day still lingered, as the sun had only just passed beyond the horizon to their west. The brothers had always had a hard time getting along with one another, or even agreeing on anything. As such, to have all of them in the same room was quite a feat on its own, and the time of night added to the extraordinary circumstance of the gathering. However, time was drawing short for them all. That was one thing that they could all agree upon. In fact, they could not even understand why they still lived. If they were going to survive, or have any chance of saving their people, they had to work together and with expedience. That, of course, meant making sacrifices. It had been their father's lifelong work to protect his kingdom from the ever-expanding empire that rose up to their west over the last several generations. Lux looked off in that direction, as if he could see them, though of course all that he saw was the wall of the basement with the dim light of candles issuing forth from its surface. The looming beast now stretched over the central regions of the continent and was bearing down upon them. Mile after mile it had chased them down and occupied land that had long belonged to their forefathers. The Empire was hoping to destroy them before they could nestle safely within the fortress-like structures of the landforms of the East, the safe haven that they had come to call the Grotto. After the Empire had dealt with the sons of Sciron, it would be free to move on to take the farthest northern and western lands. It had already conquered all of the southern territories and much of the kingdom of these 8 men. The Barshonans had been forced to retreat to a small portion of their own lands, which had a ridge of red mountains surrounding them on all sides except an open portion on their western side, which served as the borderlands between the Empire and themselves. They had abandoned the western portions of their territory in hopes of prolonging their survival from the strategic position in the east, but the men had little tangible hope. Just east of the mountains, the land dropped off with cliffs which led straight into a vast ocean. Lord Barshon had taken care in his kingdom to set up this rear keep to fall back on in times of dire strife, though he had hoped that he would never have a need for it. Yet there the 8 of them were. Their father had died the week before, while the 8 princes left behind by a deceased king would have fought over succession in regular circumstances. They did not have the leisure to do so at that time, for they knew that if they did such a thing, then none of them would inherit it. They needed to band together, if only for the length of the war. Enemies were gearing up for it, a war that the 8 princes were not equipped to fight. The eldest brother, Seir, knelt at the center of the room while the others sat resting against the far wall. Their unease was made clear by the constant shifting in both the way they sat on their stools and also the way that they stared at their brother. Seir had told his 7 younger brothers of a voice that he had been hearing for the past several months. The voice whispered to him. It taught him things and spoke of fulfilling any dream that he would wish for. Salvation. This was their chance, Seir had told them. It was all the hope that he had left. The 7 others thought that he was cracking under the pressure that had been thrust upon their shoulders. Tens of thousands of lives depended upon them and what they chose to do. He might have been crazy, but he reasoned that they would lose nothing for the trying. All the same, his brothers all eyed him full of doubt, and some even with deep concern for his well-being. Most worried more for their own fate rather than his, regardless of whether what he said was true or not. Losing their father had been hard on all of them, but with both of their parents gone, it had fallen to Seir more than anyone else to hold things together. He did not just have the family to be concerned about, but the entire kingdom, which was still attempting to avoid the war that awaited them on the horizon, for it was already lost if it came to pass. After decades of battles, they had little left in the ways of an army, and even less when it came to equipping them. Their kingdom had focused more on trade and agriculture than it had on war in its early generations. Their army had been little more than the guards from each of their towns gathered together with no collective training and maneuvering as a single unit. That had changed when the West began to rise. The king had made a proper army, and the tradesmen had been encouraged to take on crafts related to such ventures, particularly blacksmithing. Despite their best efforts, time and time again, their forces were crushed, as if they were children playing at war instead of men laying down their lives. In the face of it all, it did seem dire and perhaps even hopeless. Taru could not help but wonder if the old tomes that their father had kept in the library had corrupted the mind of his dear older brother. Taru had been inclined to stand firm against the Empire. Either they would hold them off, or they would die with haste and honor. Either was a more fitting end than what they had been driven to, the madness. With an arched back, Seer had worked for exhausting hours by the light of candles all around the room in order to prepare the designs on the floor, a brittle chunk of charcoal clutched in hand. It crumbled with each stroke upon the stone flooring, leaving behind a bold line as it did. The voice had told him of the design, put it within his mind somehow. The floor may not have been a single solid surface, being instead a collection of large slabs with thin lines between each that would not hold the material with which he drew in even lines, but Seer hoped that it would serve well enough for the task. This was one of the only places that was large enough for the design to be crafted in all of its intricacies. Of even more importance to him was the fact that here it would be hidden enough that the commoners would not know of their actions and think that the royalty had lost their minds in the wake of what was occurring. It would have stirred panic. Seer had no need to be questioned or made a fool of by the masses. He already had his brothers for that. The people would rise up against them and accept the Empire's reign. The brothers' line had conquered them a long time ago and were still foreigners to them after a sort. It seemed like a dream too good to be true, that a simple ritual born of such a design could solve all of the problems that the Bar-Sirons faced. He did not know how it worked, how it was supposed to work. He did not need to know how it worked, so long as it did. A wish granted to them. It could solve their problems, which nothing short of a miracle could do. As the design grew in both size and complexity, one by one his brothers began to stand in awe. Instead of mocking doubt or fear, wonder took over their faces as they watched. Since long before their births, their kingdom had not been one of true finery or of arts and designs. They had been forced to focus their efforts on their military for defense. As such, the only arts they knew were those of the trades of war. There had been numerous leather workers and fletchers, a good amount of masons, and a few blacksmiths. All were forced to work harsh hours and train apprentices to help them with the workload. The eldest of the brothers had gained no such training. He was trained in military strategy by his father and his most senior general, reading old manuscripts of ancient wars and strategies from all over the continent. Those were among the library from which he drew on other tomes, the nature of which concerned his brothers. They wondered if it was from there that he had gotten the designs, but no one could recall ever seeing anything other than maps in the books. Thick black lines scrawled across the floor in a circular pattern that gave many impressions of near repetition or symmetry, though, when inspected with more scrutiny, proved to lack any exact repetitions in the theme of the design. The main part of the design was a circle that had two equally sized squares drawn inside of it, with one laid over the other so that it formed an 8-pointed star, the points of which were equidistant from one another. Various markings and symbols were scattered throughout the design, forming a complex web of black that the others could not make heads or tails of. In fact, even Seer himself did not understand the exact significance of what he was doing. This is what he had seen in his mind, what the whispers told him was necessary in order for the promises that it had made to be fulfilled. With straining hands he did his best to build the image the way that he saw it in his head. His lack of skill and the utter wonder of the work betrayed the fact that something strange was at play within the shadowed room of the basement. The whispering of the thing continued within Seer's mind, yet as each of the brothers stood in order to look over the pattern, they felt as if they could hear it themselves. The words were foreign and unintelligible, though the voice was clear. It sent a shiver down their spines that made them question their decision to allow Seer to go through with this. There was no telling what it would do. For all they knew, they could be releasing something far worse upon themselves, a spirit gaining their service by manipulating them in their desperation. Yet, what choice did they have? The moon reached the height of its arc in the night sky, though the sun was still only just over the horizon. The brothers would have seen the moon resting just above them had they been able to see the sky from where they were. Not one of them was without their hesitations in this, each one having their own specific doubts. Yet they forced themselves beyond those because they knew the state of their armies. Their doubts were not unfounded, for nothing supernatural had ever been witnessed by any of them, or by anyone in their kingdom for that matter. Legends passed through the lands, told the children to give them hope, often by parents who had given up on such things decades before. Though the most common kind were dark warnings to the children, lessons in the tales meant to make the children behave in certain ways or avoid doing certain things. Yet without what Seer had promised them, they were without any hope at all. To them, a fleeting falsehood seemed better in that moment than the immutable truth of their circumstance. It was for that reason that they were willing to rely on something so intangible and distant from all that they knew. Expectations of what was to happen were mixed as much as hopes and doubts that each one of them held for the ritual. They each dreamed of a different way in which this strange act would aid them, for none of them knew with certainty what it would actually do for them, not even Seer. When at long last Seer had finished placing the final mark, he stood and looked over his creation. It stunned him. He had seen it for so long in his mind, but he could not have described it in words. In the past, he had even attempted to sketch it out on paper with one of his pens, but found that it came out as nothing more than a jumbled mess. This time, the prince had felt his mind and hand guided throughout the whole process. That very sensation had caused the man to doubt more than anything else up to that point. Even though the whole thing had seemed so strange to him already, the sensation of being directed gave him the eerie feeling that he was inviting something strange into their world and into their lives, something that he perhaps ought not to allow in. Only a few moments after he had stood to look over the work, a repetitive thudding began to sound. At first, it sounded like the march of an enormous force, and the eight grew fearful. Soon, however, it became clear that it was not the Empire closing in upon them. The building that they were in began to shake from the force. The dishes and furniture could be heard being tossed around upstairs as if it were an earthquake, though no earthquake they had ever experienced gave such a pulsing. It was more like the heart of the earth beneath them was beating. Most of the brothers braced themselves against the wall as the lines of charcoal began to vibrate and let out a low humming noise. The black dust lifted up off the ground, each from their own disjointed surface. When they were 6 inches above the floor, they snapped together in their proper place and sequence, forming a single, cohesive design. Each part of the coal began to illuminate as if it was a candle as it continued to shake at a growing frequency. As the frequency increased, so did the luminosity of the design. A few drawn-out seconds after the humming had begun, the light had managed to grow so intense that all but a single one of the brothers had turned their faces away from the light, shying away from its brilliance. Yet even faster than it had appeared, the light vanished, so that the room was left in a pitch blackness. Not even the candles that they had lit while Seer had been working provided them with any light for their secluded sanctum. The shadows collected and seemed to take on a life of their very own as the coal dust pattern rotated in an accelerating circle. Seer fell down onto his knees in the maelstrom, dust shooting over his head. The pattern dissolved as it approached and coalesced in the center of the room. His head was pushed low towards the ground in a bow as the winds picked up, ripping towards the eye of the storm. Once all of the dust had reached this singular point, all came to naught. Existence blinked, and the 8 princes found themselves in the presence of an unimaginable brilliance. When it faded, the men saw a figure in the basement room where the center of the design had once been. It had skin of midnight and eyes like the void. Then it smiled. It was an odd and toothy grin with a garish quality when contrasted to the rest of the living shadow. It did not wear anything that they could see, but all of the details of its form were all but impossible to discern. One could not see if it had any wrinkles on its face, or even see its fingers apart from one another if it were not for the light that passed between them. Only the faintest hint of light reflected off of it, which one did not notice until they looked at its eyes, which were somehow still darker than the rest of it. Its voice was a low rattle, from which words were at first hard to discern.
"You have called upon me."
It looked down at the ground, inspecting the lines that had been drawn, but were no longer there.
"I see. You are in need of something to retrieve you from your desperation, and I am your forlorn hope. What exactly is it that you need of me, though?"
It spoke in a manner that was somehow both momentous and nonchalant. Seer looked up at the figure, and his voice was as steady as waves upon a cliff in the storm. We have brought you forth that you might grant us our dream, that of salvation." Its empty eyes stared at them, its smile growing wider as it considered them, and then the grin faded.
Very well. I shall do this for you. The strength of your yearning is what drew me to you, Seer. Because you were able to bring me forth, I shall grant to each of you this thing that you seek, the power to fight the enemy that stands upon your doorstep, the thing that you believe to be the greatest desire of your heart.
The man-like figure looked over the 8 before telling them to circle around him and hold out their hands. They gathered around him as instructed, their arms extended and their hands touched so that they echoed the design of the 8-pointed star that had been in the charcoal. As they stood there before him, the summoned being began to radiate light yet again, as it had done in the beginning. As it continued growing brighter, a rumble sounded once more in the distance, this time like that of a raging storm. In each one of their right eyes they felt a strange, stinging sensation. It was not painful at first, but that soon changed as the storm outside grew more violent.
This shall be for each of you, the means by which you seek to achieve your salvation.
The light intensified and remained there among the men for but a single moment before it vanished along with the figure.
Endure, and you may yet see it.
The voice spoke in their minds. It was different than the first one had been, the one that had taught him the design to begin with, Seer noted as he clutched his hand over his eye. The princes stood in a circle, each trying to examine their own right eye, though some had fallen to their knees in pain. They looked to one another, finding that they had all experienced the same effect, though their eyes still appeared almost perfectly normal. They were not quite sure what to make of it. Their eyes merely seemed dull and without life, as if they were fake, nothing more than painted glass. However, when Lux, the second brother, raised his hand to inspect his eye, the sun withheld its light for but a moment. For a single instant, all light in the world disappeared. When it reappeared, his right eye was replaced with a yellow glow that had a slow flow to it, like a whirlwind somehow contained within a bottle. He collapsed to his knees, both eyes wide and dazed. He would be the first to experience such a change. His eye had been eaten away and replaced with a glass-like orb with a contained golden storm. In return for the loss of his eye, he became perhaps the first, even among legends that he knew, to use magic of this sort. The orb opened his eyes. Starting in that moment, he was able to see like never before, as if for the first time perceiving as he felt he always ought to have done. His brain struggled to process the vast amount of information that he was experiencing. Anything that the light touched, he saw. Even beyond that, he could tell from some inward calling out to his conscious mind that there was so much more to discover about this. He thought of all that the thing had told them in its short summons, intrigued by what they would be able to do now in order to fight off the Soliard Empire. When his mind had begun to make sense of the countless image fragments that were streaming into it, he saw what had happened, the source of the rumble. Brothers, it is done. I do not know how, but I can see it. The Empire is done for. Turned to ash. Zish, the youngest of them, ran upstairs, past the people that walked the halls of the tower, and then outside in order to look off into the distance. The sight that he would find when he ran far enough, Lux already knew. Ash. The entire thing had turned into ash. They had won, beyond all hope and understanding. They had won.